In this short Bible study today, I want to talk about the subject of the Christian Sabbath. In Exodus chapter 20, we come to very familiar words with the Ten Commandments. The fourth of the Ten Commandments is remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. What are we to make of this? How are we to practice this? Christians today are united on the binding nature of the other 9 commandments, but we come to this commandment, the fourth commandment, and there's some disagreement as to what we are to do with this. Do we today have 9 commandments or do we have 10? Do we have 9 commandments and 1 suggestion? You see, this commandment of remember the Sabbath day was not strictly a Jewish concept. It was not associated with the ceremonial law system, which passed away in the full light of its completion in the righteous life and substitutionary death of Jesus. In fact, Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 and 3 tell us that God rested from his creative activity after 6 days, and then on the 7th day he rested, and this was the institution of the Sabbath day. It says he rested and he sanctified the day and he set it apart. In Exodus chapter 16, which by the way was before the giving of the 10 commandments, we see that the Lord gave them manna to sustain them in the time of the wilderness, in their time traveling to the promised land. And they were instructed very clearly, don't go out and try to gather manna on the Sabbath day. This was not Sunday. This was the 7th day of the week, Saturday. So now we come to the New Testament, and we have the question, does the Christian today still observe the Sabbath day? Colossians 2:16, doesn't that tell us that we are not to judge one another in regards to the Sabbath? Well, it actually says that we are not to judge one another in regards to Sabbath days, plural. You see, on the Jewish calendar, they didn't only have the one weekly Sabbath on the 7th day of the week, but also in other rituals, in other ceremonies, there were other Sabbaths that were included in other celebrations. Since the Old Testament ceremonies and all of these rituals passed away in the coming of Christ, those other Sabbaths, plural, all passed away since Christ came and already did his work of redemption. In fact, right after it says we're not to judge one another in regards to Sabbath days, the very next verse refers to these as shadows. It says, now that the full body of Christ has come, the substance of those shadows has already been revealed, and so all of the shadows have passed away. These ceremonial Sabbaths, plural, have passed away. But then the question is, if those have passed away, what are we then to make of this weekly Sabbath? Well, Jesus promised the apostles in Matthew 16:19 that he would give them authority in the formation of the church. He told them, whatever you bind on earth will have been bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will have been loosed in heaven. So that means that he promised them in the formation of the early church a divine superintendence and an unfailing guidance. So when we look to what the apostles did as well as what they said in the formation of the early church, we can be confident that this was the will of God. This was to be our pattern to practice as well. So then we say, did the apostles in the early church, did they observe the Sabbath day? Did they worship on Saturday? Well, throughout the early church, what we find, if you search the Sabbath day in the New Testament, you'll find in the early church on Saturday, that was the Jewish Sabbath, the apostles were out in the synagogues evangelizing the Jews. On the first day of the week, Sunday, that's when they met together to worship. In fact, 1 Corinthians 16, verses 1 and 2 refers to the church meeting together on the first day of the week. Acts 20 and verse 7 speaks of them being gathered together to listen to the proclamation of the word on the first day of the week and to observe the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week. So clearly, the apostles and the early church changed their day of meeting from the seventh day of the week, Saturday, to the first day of the week, Sunday. Revelation chapter 1 and verse 10, John said he was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. That was the first day of the week. So then we ask the question, why the change? Well, Jesus rose from the dead, as we know, on the first day of the week. And right from that point, we find the disciples gathered together, memorializing the resurrection of Christ from the dead on the first day of the week. From the very beginning, remember that first Sunday night, the disciples were meeting together. Thomas wasn't there. He skipped church on Sunday night. That was when Jesus appeared to them. Just as God did his creative work for 6 days and then rested on the seventh day, instituted the Sabbath day, Jesus did his redemptive work and then rose from the dead on the first day of the week and rested. Hebrews chapter 1 says that he did his work and then sat down at the right hand of God. The work was completed at the resurrection. It is finished, Jesus said. That's why Hebrews 4 and verse 9 tells us that the Sabbath, that there remains a Sabbath rest or a keeping of the Sabbath for the people of God. And that word that is used for rest there is a different word than is used for the word rest, not only in that passage, but in all the other references in the New Testament. The only time that word is used, and it literally means a keeping of the Sabbath. And it tells us, again, Hebrews 4:9, that this remains for the people of God today. It's to be a blessing to us, and it's something that is not going to be taken from us. It's not supposed to be a burden. It's a blessing that we ought to be thankful for. On the first day of the week, we come together and we celebrate the finished work of Jesus Christ. In essence, every Sunday is kind of like an Easter Sunday, and that's why it's referred to as the Lord's Day. Now, my point in this video isn't to talk about how we observe the Lord's Day, the Christian Sabbath, other than we ought to come together to worship, but to make it clear that Sunday, the first day of the week, is now the Christian Sabbath.